The morning air was crisp as Emma Miller stepped onto her porch, clutching her coffee mug tightly in her hands. The small town of Ashford was always quiet this time of year, its narrow streets framed by golden leaves and the soft hum of life. Yet, something felt different, too quiet. Emma glanced at the house across the street, the Petersons' home. Normally, their dog, Toby, barked incessantly at anything that moved. Today, silence. The curtains, usually drawn wide open, were tightly shut. A faint unease prickled at the back of her neck. The oddness escalated when she walked down the street later that afternoon. Mr. Greaves, the retired postman who spent hours pruning his rose bushes, was nowhere to be seen. His immaculate garden was untouched, the petals drooping slightly as if mourning their caretaker's absence. The Greens' house next door was eerily dark, though Emma distinctly remembered seeing them loading groceries into their car just yesterday. By evening, the unease turned into full-blown dread. She called her best friend, Sarah, who lived on the other side of town. "You're imagining things, Emma," Sarah said, her voice dismissive. "Maybe people are just taking trips or something. It's almost fall break." "No," Emma insisted, pacing her living room. "It's not just that. The Petersons would have told me if they were going anywhere. And Mr. Greaves? He hasn't missed a single day in his garden in years." Sarah sighed. "I'll come over tomorrow and we'll figure it out, okay? Don't stress." But tomorrow never came. The next morning, Emma found herself staring at her phone. Sarah hadn't called, hadn't texted, nothing. Emma dialed her number, but it went straight to voicemail. She decided to drive to Sarah's house, but when she arrived, the house looked wrong. Her car was still in the driveway, but the windows were dark, and the air around the house seemed heavy, oppressive. Emma knocked on the door, her heartbeat quickening. No answer. She pressed her ear to the wood and thought she heard a faint shuffling sound, like someone walking barefoot on carpet. But when she peered through the window, the house looked completely empty. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Her street, once a comforting tableau of suburban life, felt like a trap. House after house was dark, their inhabitants seemingly erased. She tried calling the police, but the line was busy every time she dialed. The rest of the town seemed oblivious, or worse, complicit. Even the grocery store clerk avoided her eyes when she asked if they'd noticed anything strange. By the third day, Emma was one of the only people left on her street. She watched through her window as a moving truck pulled up to the Jenkins house late at night. Two men dressed in gray uniforms emerged and began loading boxes. But Emma knew the Jenkins hadn't packed a thing. She had seen them that morning, still sipping coffee on their porch. When she tried to confront the men, she found herself unable to cross the threshold of her own yard. Her legs felt like lead, her voice caught in her throat. The next morning, the Jenkins house was pristine and untouched, as if they had never existed. Desperation took hold. Emma began leaving notes on doors, hoping someone would reply. She slipped letters under mats, taped messages to mailboxes, but no one answered. She started hearing things at night, faint whispers just outside her bedroom window, the sound of footsteps pacing the hall even though she lived alone. When she looked out the window, she saw figures standing in the shadows between the streetlights, unmoving and silent. She tried to leave. Packing her car with the few belongings she could grab, she sped toward the town limits. But no matter which road she took, she always ended up back on her street, her car rolling to a stop in front of her house as if guided by an unseen force. One night, unable to sleep, she ventured into the Petersons' backyard, flashlight in hand. The beam of light caught something strange, a hole in the ground, perfectly round and impossibly dark. It wasn't there before. As she approached, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't in English, they weren't in any language Emma had ever heard. The hole seemed to breathe, exhaling cold air that made her skin crawl. Emma backed away, but the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell, tumbling into the abyss. When she woke, She was in her own bed. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, and for a brief, blissful moment, she thought it had all been a dream. But as she stepped outside, she realized her street was completely empty. Every house was dark. Every yard was overgrown. Her phone showed no service, and the clock on her wall had stopped. Emma was the last one left. Or so she thought. That night, as she stared out her window, she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing motionless in the street. Their faces were blank, featureless, but somehow, she knew they were watching her. And then they began to move toward her house. The house on Maple Street had always been shrouded in whispers. Its peeling paint and sagging roof stood as a testament to its age, but what set it apart was its basement, a place no one ever dared to enter. When Rachel and her husband, Mark, bought the property, the real estate agent had been oddly evasive when they asked about the locked door at the bottom of the stairs. "It's just storage," the agent had said with a tight smile. "Probably nothing you'd want to see." But Rachel had always been curious, sometimes to a fault. So when they moved in, the first thing she did was locate the rusted key left hanging on a nail in the kitchen. "Why don't we just leave it?" Mark said as she jingled the key in her hand. "We have enough to deal with unpacking. Don't you want to know what's down there?" Rachel replied, already heading toward the basement door. Mark sighed and followed. The stairs creaked loudly as they descended, the air growing colder with each step. The basement smelled of damp earth and mildew, the kind of scent that clung to your skin. The only light came from a single bulb that flickered weakly when Rachel pulled the chain. The basement was unremarkable at first glance, old shelves lined with dusty jars, broken furniture, and a cracked cement floor. But in the far corner, hidden beneath a tattered tarp, they found it, a well. Its stones were moss-covered, and the darkness within seemed to go on forever. "Who puts a well in a basement?" Mark asked, his voice uneasy. "Maybe the house was built over it," Rachel suggested, though the explanation didn't sit well with her. Something about the well felt wrong. She leaned closer, peering into the abyss. "Do you hear that?" Mark frowned. "Hear what?" Rachel held up a hand for silence. At first, it sounded like a faint dripping of water, but then it grew louder, almost like a whisper. A voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed up from the darkness. It was speaking her name. "Nope," Mark said, grabbing her arm. "We're done here." Rachel hesitated but allowed herself to be pulled back upstairs. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the well. The voice had been so clear, so deliberate. She dreamt of it, of shadows rising from its depths and cold hands dragging her down. The next day, Mark boarded up the basement door. "Problem solved," he said, brushing his hands off. But the whispers didn't stop. Rachel began hearing them throughout the house, soft murmurs just at the edge of perception. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But then she saw the water. It started as small puddles forming near the basement door. No matter how much they mopped, the water returned, seeping through the cracks. "We need to call someone," Rachel said, but Mark was dismissive. "It's just an old house. Pipes leak. It's nothing." But Rachel wasn't so sure. One night, unable to sleep, she crept downstairs. The boards over the basement door were damp, the wood swollen and rotting. Without thinking, she grabbed a crowbar and pried them loose. The door swung open on its own, as if inviting her in. The basement was colder than before, and the whispers louder. They didn't just call her name now, they begged, pleaded, cried. Rachel found herself standing at the edge of the well, staring into its black void. The water inside shimmered, reflecting something that wasn't the basement ceiling. She saw faces, dozens of them, pale and contorted in agony. "Help us," they moaned. A hand shot out of the water, skeletal and dripping, grabbing her wrist. Rachel screamed, pulling back with all her strength, but the grip was unrelenting. The faces in the water began to rise, their mouths open in silent screams. Just as she thought she would be dragged in, Mark appeared, yanking her away from the well. He slammed the tarp back over it and dragged her upstairs. "What were you thinking?" he shouted. But Rachel couldn't answer. She was shaking too badly, her wrist bruised where the hand had grabbed her. The next morning, they called a contractor to seal the basement entirely. Cement was poured over the floor, trapping the well beneath layers of stone and earth. But the house didn't feel any safer. The whispers didn't stop. Rachel began waking up with dirt under her fingernails, as if she'd been digging in her sleep. Mark found her one night standing in the living room, her eyes glazed over, mumbling incoherently about the well. "It's still there," she said. "It wants us." One night, Mark woke to find Rachel gone. The basement door, which should have been sealed shut, stood wide open. He rushed down the stairs, calling her name, but the basement was empty except for the well, its tarp cast aside. Water pooled around its edges, and the whispers were deafening now. Mark leaned over the edge, his flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. "Rachel," he shouted, his voice cracking. For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, a face emerged from the water. It was Rachel, but her eyes were wrong, empty and black, her mouth twisted into a grin that wasn't hers. "Come down," she whispered. "It's better here." The flashlight slipped from Mark's hands, plunging into the well. He stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the stairs, and scrambled to his feet. The whispers grew louder, echoing in his mind. He ran, slamming the basement door behind him and fleeing the house. When the police arrived, they found the basement empty. The well was gone, replaced by solid cement. But Mark knew better. He left the house that day and never returned. Months later, a new family moved in, their laughter filling the halls. But at night, if they listened closely, they could hear it, a faint dripping sound, followed by whispers calling their names.